They say Africa must wait. Wait for aid. Wait for approval. Wait for someone else to decide when the future begins. But in the red dust of Burkina Faso, a 17-year-old boy has already broken that spell. With nothing but scrap metal scorched wires and a stubborn dream, he built an electric car that rolls on streets where most believed only despair could travel. Do you remember being 17? In America, many of our children were told what they could not do. Too young, too poor, too black. Our parents heard it when they tried to vote. Our grandparents heard it in the fields. You cannot. It is the same song sung to Africa for centuries. Yet here is a boy, Ould Sorgo, who refused to hear it. Picture his father's workshop, the smell of oil, the clang of hammers, piles of rusted parts that others called trash. From that silence of abandonment, he carved a voice of innovation. When his car lit up for the first time with headlights piercing the night, the people stopped in their tracks. Some gasped, some cheered, others whispered, "This is possible." But this story is not just about one boy. It is about a continent daring to rise and a leader daring to say no to dependency. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stands at the center of the storm, urging young Africans to turn knowledge into power and scraps into sovereignty. So I ask you, if a boy can build a car from nothing, what can a nation build when it finally believes in itself? If you believe Africa must stop waiting, stay with us. In a narrow corner of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, stands a workshop that looks more like a junkyard than a birthplace of dreams. Rusted iron rods lean against splintered wood. Frayed electrical wires hang like tired vines from the ceiling. The air smells of burnt oil and dust, the kind that clings to your skin long after you leave. It is here, not in a laboratory, not in a university hall, that a boy named Ould Sorgo began shaping the impossible. When he was a child, the neighborhood children knew him as the boy who made toy cars. He would gather broken motors from discarded radios wires, from old fans' plastic wheels from broken strollers. Other children played with them. For Ould, they were more than toys. They were blueprints, tiny rehearsals for a stage no one else could see. One day, he told himself, "I will build a car that carries people." At that time, it was only a whisper in his mind. But a whisper can become thunder when matched with persistence. By the age of 17, Ould no longer dreamed on paper. He dreamed in metal. He scavenged pieces from garbage heaps, pulling apart the skeletons of broken bicycles, scavenging bolts, strips of steel old leather seats. His father's modest workshop became his kingdom, though its treasures looked worthless to anyone else. Where most saw junk, Ould saw raw material. Every piece of rust was a possibility. Every broken circuit was a chance to learn. There were nights when the welding sparks lit the workshop like fireworks. Nights when the circuit failed, the battery would not charge, or the wheels bent under pressure. Some days he burned his hands. Other days he nearly gave up. But each setback became a teacher. He taught himself welding by trial and error. He studied the guts of electric motors through online tutorials, sneaking into local tech events just to ask questions. He learned patience in the rhythm of hammering hope, in the hiss of solder against metal. Months passed, and the shape of a car began to emerge. Not a model, not a toy. A frame sturdy enough to hold 2 seats. Wheels strong enough to turn on the open road. A motor wired to batteries he salvaged and rewired. It was not sleek like a Tesla, nor polished like a showroom vehicle. But in its rough edges lived a miracle, a working electric car built entirely from scrap, from nothing but grit and imagination. The numbers tell one story: 30 kilometers per hour, 50 kilometers on a single charge. But numbers alone do not capture the sight of that machine standing proudly in the dim light of the workshop. A child's dream made flesh in steel. Nor do they capture the heartbeat of the boy who stood over it, grease on his hands, eyes glowing with something larger than pride. For Ould, that moment was not just about an invention. It was proof that Africa could create without waiting, without begging, without borrowing. Proof that a boy with nothing but persistence could rewrite the word impossible. And yet, behind that proof lay a question heavier than any piece of metal he welded. Would this be just one boy's triumph, or the beginning of something greater? Because for every spark that lit his workshop, there were shadows waiting outside. Poverty, lack of schooling, the silence of a world that often applauds but rarely invests. And so, the dream that began in scrap was more than a car. It was a test of resilience, of belief, of a nation's will to rise with him. But the road ahead would test more than his skills. It would test the soul of a nation. The day came when the car was no longer a secret of shadows and sparks. Oud wheeled it out of his father's workshop, its frame still raw, its paint unpolished, its headlights staring into the Burkinabe sun like unblinking eyes. To some, it looked unfinished. To him, it was alive. He slid into the seat, a seat stitched from worn leather his father once kept for repairs, and turned the ignition. A hum rose low at first, then steady. The car shuddered, then steadied, as if gathering its courage. When the wheels began to roll, the street itself seemed to pause. Neighbors leaned from doorways. Children ran alongside their laughter, chasing the car down the road. Men stopped mid-step with sacks of grain on their shoulders. Women carrying water paused, eyes wide. Some clapped. Some simply stared. Others pulled out their phones to record what felt like history unfolding on an ordinary street. The car moved not with the roar of gasoline, but with a whisper gliding smooth on electric breath. 30 kilometers per hour may not impress a world of supercars, but in that moment, it was as if Oud had outrun the weight of impossibility. 50 kilometers of range stretched before him like a promise. At the front of the car, bolted proudly, was a nameplate. Not Toyota, not Tesla. Just one word, Oud. His declaration, his signature, his flag on the battlefield of doubt. Every car has a badge. This one carried his soul. Watching from the edge of the crowd stood his father, innocent Sorgo. His arms were crossed, his face stern as if measuring every movement. But inside, pride swelled like a drumbeat. He remembered the boy who once rode a bicycle to school. He remembered the day that bicycle no longer needed pedals when Oud had turned it into an electric bike using salvage parts. He had seen the signs. He had whispered to himself, "This boy will go far." And now the street was whispering it back. Days later, the whispers reached beyond the neighborhood. At the International Conference of Young Geniuses of Faso, Oud stood on a stage that seemed far bigger than his years. In his hand, a certificate, thin paper, yet heavy with meaning. The applause echoed, cameras flashed. Officials shook his hand. It was recognition, yes. But behind the smiles, he felt something deeper, the weight of expectation. He remembered the nights in the workshop, the burns on his hands, the frustration of circuits that refused to work. This certificate was not just ink. It was every failure turned into faith, every setback turned into strength. He looked at his father in the audience, nodded, and held it high. But recognition without resources is a fragile crown. The car was real, but unfinished. He dreamed of adding solar panels, of making it self-sufficient, of proving Africa could leap into clean mobility without waiting for imports. Yet the parts were expensive, the school fees unpaid, the future uncertain. Still, as he drove his car through the streets again, this time with the sun glinting off the windshield and children chanting his name, he knew one truth: he had started something that could not be ignored. But recognition without resources is a crown without gold. The story of one boy cannot be told without the story of his nation. In the heart of Burkina Faso, another figure stands young like Oud, but carrying the weight of millions. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, at only 36, is not just a head of state. To many, he is the echo of Thomas Sankara, reborn a soldier who dares to say what Africa has long been told not to say: we will build for ourselves. When Traoré speaks, it is not the language of polished diplomats. His words strike like a drumbeat. Independence is not a flag. Independence is the power to make our own bread, our own machines, our own future. In his vision, sovereignty is not measured in speeches or ceremonies, but in the tangible tractors in the fields, buses on the streets, and yes, electric cars rolling through African roads with no foreign logo stamped on their front. It is no coincidence that Oud's invention drew the attention of this leader. For Traoré, youth is not a problem to manage, but a weapon to unleash. He has called on schools to move beyond formulas and dusty textbooks and teach the making of machines. He tells young people, your hands can carry the nation further than any borrowed theory. And in Oud, he sees proof. Proof that knowledge, when transformed into creation, is more powerful than dependency. Policies have followed his words. Gold mines, once siphoned by foreign corporations, are now nationalized, their revenues redirected to fund schools, infrastructure, and housing for the displaced. A national refinery stands as a symbol of wealth finally held by Burkinabe hands. Tractors, harvesters, and irrigation machines are being distributed to farmers in what he calls the agricultural offensive, aiming to make Burkina Faso not just self-sufficient but abundant. In cities, fleets of new buses ease the burden of travel for workers. And on the horizon, plans for local automotive production seek to ensure that Yud's dream does not remain a lonely spark, but becomes an industry. For the diaspora watching from afar, this language rings familiar. It carries the spirit of civil rights marches, the demand to build what was denied to stand when told to kneel. To older ears, Traore's challenge recalls the sermons of black preachers who said, "Do not wait for Pharaoh's bread. Bake your own." And yet behind the applause, his path is dangerous. By turning away from France, by resisting Western models of aid, he has drawn sharp eyes from across the Atlantic. Washington whispers of authoritarianism. Paris accuses him of chaos. But the people in Ouagadougou do not see chaos. They see a leader who walks with soldiers, eats with villagers, prays with elders. They see a leader who, like Yud, dares to build with what is at hand. There is power in symbols. A boy's car rolling on scrap wheels. A captain's voice rolling through the streets. Together they weave a single story, Africa refusing to wait. But symbols alone cannot sustain a nation. For every invention, for every speech, there are forces ready to break the momentum. Poverty insurgency sanctions isolation. Traore knows this. Yud lives this. And still they move forward one car, one policy, one declaration at a time. Imagine Traore standing before the youth, his voice carrying across the square. If we can build a gun, why not a car? If we can build a car, why not a future? The crowd roars. And in the front row sits Yud holding the keys to his creation, knowing that his dream is no longer his alone. Yet every dream that rises in Africa casts a shadow that others seek to silence. Every rising sun casts a shadow. For all the applause that followed Yud's invention, the reality outside his workshop remained unchanged, perhaps even heavier. In Burkina Faso, the war with insurgent groups rages on. Since Captain Traoré took power in 2022, more than 17,000 lives have been lost in conflict. Villages have been emptied, families displaced, entire regions scarred by violence that refuses to fade. Yud's own neighborhood bears the weight of this uncertainty. Every siren, every rumor of attack reminds him that creation in Africa is always born under fire. But not all shadows come from the battlefield. Some come from within. The government's grip on power has tightened. International media speak of censorship of television channels, shut down of journalists, forced into silence or conscription. Critics call Traoré authoritarian, a soldier-turned-ruler who fears the free voice of the people. Supporters counter that survival demands discipline, that in a nation under siege order must sometimes outweigh freedom. For ordinary citizens like Yud, the truth is not in headlines, but in daily struggle. Buying bread as prices rise, paying school fees when wages collapse, watching neighbors disappear into the night without explanation. And then comes the bitterest irony. While Yud's car drew cheers, his education stalled. This year, he could not return to school. His family simply did not have the money. At only 17, his mind raced ahead with dreams of solar-powered engines and national factories, yet his present was shackled by something as small, as crushing, as unpaid tuition. Imagine it, the boy who could design a vehicle to carry others down the road could not secure his own seat in a classroom. He still returns to the workshop each day, notebook in hand, sketching improvements in pencil lines smudged by grease. A small solar panel lies on the hood of his car, not yet connected, waiting for the right components that he cannot afford. Each unfinished circuit is both a promise and a warning, the promise of what Africa could achieve, the warning of what it will lose if such sparks are left to die. His father watches with quiet pride, but also with worry. He knows determination alone cannot solder wires or buy batteries. He knows that without support, even the brightest fire can sputter into silence. Innocent remembers the civil wars, the coups, the broken promises of leaders. He has seen too many young men consumed by poverty's teeth. Will his son be different? Or will history once again smother potential before it breathes its full breath? And beyond his family, there are forces eager to claim what Yud has built. In a world where patents are written in Western capitals, where ideas born in Africa are too often stolen and repackaged, his invention risks becoming another exploited treasure. What happens if foreign investors swoop in offering pennies for a design worth millions, then stamp their own name on the hood? What happens if Yud's car becomes the world's next sensation without Yud, without Burkina Faso, without Africa owning a single part of it? This is the shadow beneath the applause. A continent rich in talent, yet poor in protection. A boy with vision, yet barred by poverty. A leader calling for sovereignty, yet criticized for repression. The contradictions pile like scrap in a workshop, waiting to be forged into something stronger or left to rust. Picture Yud in the silence of the night, the glow of a single lamp on his notebook. He sketches, erases, rewires. He is building not just a machine, but a question. His car is proof that Africa can. But the silence around him asks, will Africa allow it? So the question is, will his fire be fueled or extinguished? The story of Yud and his electric car is not an isolated spark. Across the continent, similar fires are breaking out, fires not of destruction, but of invention. In Nigeria, a young man welded together a replica of the Tesla Cybertruck from scrap metal, proving that what the West calls luxury, Africans can reimagine with bare hands. In Rwanda, startups designed drones to deliver blood and medicine to villages unreachable by road-saving lives where ambulances could never go. In Zimbabwe, a man named Sangulani Chikumbutso claims to have built a self-powering vehicle, stirring both admiration and skepticism. Each story is different, but together they form a mosaic Africa no longer asking permission to innovate. This is the soil in which Ibrahim Traoré plants his vision. Alongside Mali and Niger Burkina, Faso has broken away from the West African bloc, ECOWAS, to form the Alliance of Sahel States. Together, they speak of shared sovereignty, a joint development bank biometric passports infrastructure built with African hands. Critics abroad see instability. Supporters at home see liberation. For the first time in decades, leaders in the Sahel are not asking, what does Paris want? They are asking, what do our people need? Culture, too, becomes a weapon. Under Traoré, Burkina Faso has invested in symbols of memory. The Thomas Sankara Memorial, designed by the world-renowned architect Francis Kerr, stands not just as stone, but as scripture telling every passerby that Sankara's dream did not die. The Pan-African Film Festival FESPACO is no longer just cinema. It is a pulpit, a place where African stories preach to the world. These monuments remind the youth that they are heirs to a covenant, not beggars for validation. And in that covenant, Yud's car is not just a machine. It is prophecy. When he drives it through the streets, it is as if Sankara whispers through the engine, dare to invent the future. When Traoré calls for self-reliance, Yud becomes his living proof. And when other young Africans see his invention on a phone screen, something stirs a conviction that their own dusty backyards could be laboratories of destiny. But revolutions come with enemies. Western capitals remain silent when African youth create, yet loud when African leaders reject dependency. Aid agencies question sustainability but ignore the truth. Dependency was never sustainable. Think tanks in Washington and Paris write reports calling Traoré a populist, a danger to democracy. Yet in the markets of Ouagadougou, in the fields of Kaya, in the classrooms where children draw cars on chalkboards, the sentiment is different. He listens. He believes. He dares. This is the Great Reset, Africa refusing the old script, not waiting for investors to arrive, but building with what is at hand, not depending on foreign machines, but crafting their own, not accepting borrowed futures, but writing their own covenants. From Yud's car to Traoré's policies, from local crops to regional banks, the message is the same: we will no longer wait. Picture the future that flickers in their minds, neighborhoods of solar-powered homes, buses built in African factories, students learning coding alongside welding cars, like Yud's, multiplied not by one boy's persistence, but by a nation's choice. The streets no longer filled with silence, but with the hum of inventions that carry Africa forward. But the world still asks, can Africa truly rise without permission? What began in a small workshop in Burkina Faso is more than a boy's triumph. It is a question laid before a continent and before all of us who watch from afar. Can Africa rise, not by waiting, but by building? Can a dream forged in scrap metal become the foundation of sovereignty? Yud's car is not polished, not perfect, but neither was freedom when our ancestors first claimed it. The march across Selma's bridge was not paved in certainty. The cries of Sankara were not wrapped in comfort. Liberation has always looked fragile at first, until a people decide it will not break. Captain Ibrahim Traoré understands this truth. He does not stand as a flawless hero. His rule carries shadows. Censorship, conflict, sacrifice, measured in blood. But beneath those shadows, he is pushing a generation to believe in themselves, to build with their own hands, to reject the lie of dependence. He dares to say what empires fear most: Africa can stand alone. And so the story of a 17-year-old boy with a car becomes more than inspiration. It becomes a declaration, a sign that the soil remembers the ancestors remember and the youth refuse to forget. But here is the warning. If Africa does not protect its inventors, the world will steal them. If leaders do not invest, the fire will flicker out. If we, the diaspora, remain silent, we betray the covenant carved by chains and prayers generations ago. Yet there is also hope. Imagine a future where thousands of youths rise across the continent, where every village has a workshop, every child has the tools to turn knowledge into power, and every leader carries the courage to say no to dependency. That future is not fantasy. It is waiting not for aid, but for faith. So I ask you, watching now, would you ride in Youth's car? Would you trust Africa's hands to build its destiny? Do you believe that what started in one dusty workshop can ignite a revolution across an entire continent? If your heart whispers yes, then speak it out loud. Say it in the comments, Africa forward. Say it like a vow. Say it like a prayer. Because Africa does not need permission to rise, it needs conviction. He said no. Will you